Hello and welcome to 52 Weeks. This week we're finally closing out Chapter 5 Housing. This section is looking at the very end, which is looking at the building blocks of a housing strategy. This whole last subsection looks at how to create innovation within a housing strategy that can affect the rest of the next decade. Quote from the comp plan, Harrisburg possesses a number of advantages as a state capital. However, there must be consistent effort to build momentum and continued forward progress. How do we build that progress specifically in housing strategy? Well, that is with the city's redevelopment authority and the housing authority. Both are equipped with land holdings and tools that can be leveraged to strengthen the housing market. And all of this can be done as the innovation starts with us. It has to be something that is grassroots led. The reason why it needs to be grassroots led is that in the past 3 decades, it's been in the hands of politicians and in the hands of the local real estate and developers. It hasn't been managed well. My theory is that if it was managed well, we wouldn't be in the state of things where we're at with these gaps in housing. People who are in position haven't been innovative enough. They haven't been looking outside the box, so to speak, and looking at other cities and other ways to develop policy that works in very public-private partnerships in a way that cares for the dignity of people in the city. Here's a quote from the comp plan. Compared to the surrounding localities, the city's upward movement in rental and for sale pricing is tepid at best and has not been consistently strong enough to move it from the 60% rental, 40% ownership ratio. In developing this innovation, the overall recommendations for Harrisburg's housing strategy fall into 3 categories. The first is stabilization and preservation, the second is rehabilitation and maintenance, and the third is repositioning and redevelopment. These are the simple facts to be looking at and developing a strategy that all works in conjunction in relationship with each other, and the mechanisms of financing, the mechanism of construction, the mechanism of financial literacy, the mechanism of education. All of these things are mechanisms that we need to be focused on these areas. All of these things can be working together in a local economy that actually benefits our city. So the way this is laid out, there are 4 main goals, and then there's objectives, and then there's actions. Just like any other chapter, I'm not going to go into every single specific action and not even every single specific objective. I will highlight the ones that I find important. I am going to touch on all 4 goals. The first goal is to preserve existing housing stock. We know all these statistics from prior discussion with the 76 residential property of buildings in the city. So if you look at our quality of our housing, as if our housing quality is low, then our city value quality is going to be reflected as well. 89% of Harrisburg's residential building stock was built before 1959, and the potential aggregate value of these historic neighborhoods are worth more to the city than the sum of individual structures. We know that if we look at them in groups, that the value is worth more as a group instead of the sum of individual structures. So we need to change that mindset from a suburban objectified mindset. I think this is interesting because going back to Matt Frederick's discussion last April at the Midtown Scholar, talked about the objectification of space and place and buildings. And the idea here is that we look at things in the objects and we objectify buildings in our real estate, and that actually in turn hurts us because we don't see the collective value. Continuing in this issue, there's an issue of oversupply and understanding how to take some of that offline. This is a mechanism that needs to be developed. The city must implement an approach that reduces oversupply of housing, particularly substandard housing, as identifying this and then figure out how to take it offline and work on it and deal with it and put the right mechanisms and organizations in place that can deal with that. So we want to look at innovative ways to reduce inventory and expand market rate opportunities. So this is positioning properties in a way that can be beneficial to the city, not to the beneficial of a developer or a particular contractor. This has to be balanced well. I think this is where we can use the skill set of building trades and fine carpentry skills and also property management, education, and financial literacy. We can roll that all into here is how do we develop our properties from within. The value paradox that historic cities have, this is our aging city, is that the replacement value of individual buildings is very high. That's a given. We're not getting away from that. The current sales value is relatively low. Restoration is expensive. The aggregate value is greater than the repayment value, and the future tax revenue is greater than the program reinvestment capital. All right, given all these things, it makes sense to say, oh, from an economic point of view and return on investment, there's no way I'm going to invest in Harrisburg. That's our faulty logic that we have because we are devaluing this idea of social capital, the people in place, that the people matter, the place matter. So for all of those that are focused on return on investment, stop thinking that way and get involved in a way that works with people in place. Another key point is stabilization and preservation. The city must quickly absorb 4,700 vacant housing units. A grassroots model of neighborhood investment is necessary. The city's entities should be working in tandem with local community groups, not leading the effort, but guiding and providing some mentorship as well as mechanisms and thinking outside the box, as well as community members needing to push into the city and to be demanding of them to be doing something because they work for us. This is in creating policy that deals with vacant properties, vacant lots, and demolished structures. Those are the three main items that all the community groups should be thinking about. So how does this actually happen? There's the term asset mapping. This is part of planning process. We want to understand the scoring of individual houses or structures based on their current status, and then we want to look at scoring the neighborhoods and sub-neighborhoods and start to figure out how do we address each of those areas and how do we build that up. This can be done through a GIS crowdsource mapping process that has to be set up. This just doesn't invent itself. What happens is that people that know this stuff will do it for developers, they'll do it for builders or real estate agents, and that's the problem, is that it becomes in a single private hand instead of a publicly owned entity. A community development corporation should be on this. There's no reason why in this day and age Harrisburg doesn't have that as a basis. So this can be done through GIS crowd mapping, and this involves ranking the property parcel prioritization. Which ones do we need to deal with first? It's kind of like triage, looking at which ones really need help. The next one is coding. This is property parcel strategies. Okay, what are we going to do with this property now that we have it? These things go hand in hand. This takes some expertise in understanding the status of the building, the structural issues, some code issues. Anything that's out there needs to be ranked and coded. So if we take the comprehensive plan recommendations for a core strategy, this is looking at demand generation. This is internal and external, looking at what's the internal demand and external outside our city, plus the supply management, meaning that we've got a way to manage what's out there. All this added together gives you optimal asset disposition. That gives the city the ability to begin to put properties out there that are packaged in a way that benefits residents that live here. When we're looking at planning, after we go through understanding the existing assets, we can look at the neighborhood nodes. We want to know where elderly housing are, the primetime empty nester housing, the new contemporary units of non-single family, non-fee simple housing. These new housing types are things we should be thinking about within our neighborhoods to make them more diverse from a building type viewpoint. We can't continue to focus on fee simple or single family housing. That has failed. That has to be a change in our perception, and it changes through government, it changes through our real estate, it changes through developers, it changes through our local businesses and industry. Once we start to look at these nodes, then we can strengthen the core and work outwards. The goal here is to prepare plans for developers, and you can use the Seed Network Foundation. This is the method of social, economic, environmental, and design network. Also, there's community toolbox that's out there of how to build this from a grassroots level. Target desired markets. This is something where we need to know some of the input of markets and what the desire is, and this is something the city can help with. Develop an urban design strategy and pre-approve with city agencies. When we start to put a plan together, a small area plan, these things can then be working with the agencies to find that next level of how this development can happen. And also administer and manage this well. That's the city's function in all this. We can then develop an accelerated permit approval process that if projects conform to the desires of a plan, then they get fast tracked. We can also provide financial incentives for compliant investment. Once that's all established, we can look at repositioning and redevelopment. We want to right size the supply and demand balance. This takes an ongoing process. We want to provide long-term economic stability and to generate full spectrum and healthy housing opportunities for everyone. And we want to offer significant investment capital in the city. And this is looking at reinvestment within the neighborhoods that are out there. A quote from the comp plan: the city needs to focus on developing an increased palette of redevelopment incentives under a blanket program. The suggestion for this name could be Harrisburg 2000 program, or it could be called the HBG 2K program. Naming does matter. This is getting 2,000 new households into the city over the next 5 years. So if we had this mindset, we'd work together not to do what we've currently done, this live, work, play thing, which looks at new single family homes. That's not what we need. We need to change that mindset. This is decades of this single house idea, an American dream idea that just is not working. It's not working in other cities, and it's not working here. So here's a few that I am going to go and list more of the objectives and actions. Objective 5.1.1, stabilize and preserve the existing buildings. Identification mapping of problem properties. Create a vacant building registration. Establish a troubled building initiative. Establish a neighborhood livability program. This would be a multi-departmental task force to enhance existing code enforcement efforts. The next objective, 5.1.2, strategic demolition. This should have a strategic demolition map that's updated regularly. Demolition of architectural structurally significant housing stock or building comprising continuous building fabric should be avoided if possible. Okay, this is one of the things we should be looking at in demolition. We've talked about that a lot. Property not on the strategic demolition map should be subjected to the demolition tax. Objective 5.1.3, stimulate absorption of vacant and distressed properties. So we can create a branded network to package vacant and distressed properties for investors. We need inventory identification, brand city property initiative, selection of realtor network, agreement on collaboration with other property owners. These can happen from within a citywide system that's been looking at vacant and distressed properties. Objective 5.1.3, stimulate absorption of vacant and distressed properties. So we can create a branded network to package vacant and distressed properties for investors. We need inventory identification, brand city property initiative, selection of realtor network, agreement on collaboration with other property owners. These can happen from within a citywide system that's been looking at vacant and distressed properties. Objective 5.1.4, maximize local economic multiplier effect of increasing housing sector construction activity expenditures. All right, what does that mean? We want to prioritize the use of high-quality city-based contractors, establish building and landscape skill training programs to employ city residents on city-based maintenance projects or construction projects. We want to develop capacity for maintenance, skills development for building trades and landscape as craft with an emphasis on fine skills pertaining to historic buildings, and we can create that as an institute locally. Create long-term capacity for building maintenance and construction in the city, and develop a fine building trades cluster in the city that we have their own network that builds this. Objective 5.1.5, increase code enforcement capacity. This looks at the increased staff to enforce inspections of building construction, electrical standards, plumbing, health, and sanitation. This also looks at property management codes for residential and commercial structures. We have an increased inspection of renter-occupied housing for compliance with the city building maintenance code. We also can look at create a codes fund from revenue generated from code citations to augment the number of inspectors and support activities of volunteer inspectors, thus connecting the quality of code inspectors with the quantity of code violations. Explore the creation of part-time and volunteer inspector units. Objective 5.1.6, address health issues associated with older building stock. This looks at coordinating and broadening the range of programs, looking at lead paint removal mitigation, asbestos removal, mold remediation, any structural inspections. All of this stuff is packaged into how to deal with older buildings. Objective 5.1.7, facilitate reemergence of historic building stocks as an investment grade asset class. This objectives look at all the actions involving mapping continuous area of valued historic housing stock and looking at targeted accelerated housing maintenance and restoration efforts, develop a dual valuation mechanism for city properties in identified areas, looking at funding and valuation, develop a financing program which finance the historic houses as a 99-year asset class. Objective 5.1.8, provide mechanism for households building wealth through property appreciation. Develop a restoration program through the proposed trades training program, directly preparing historic building stock for sale and rental occupancy, and looking at in the early phases target development for sale historic housing units in targeted redevelopment areas and areas already providing high levels of community, commercial, and amenities.